Here at the Contemporary Jewish Museum, we've really been thinking about what makes for a transformative educational experience, and hopefully we're going to unpack that a little bit more tonight. Our mission at the Contemporary Jewish Museum is to make the diversity of the Jewish experience relevant for a 21st century audience. So what does that have to do with bringing a science teacher and a museum exhibition developer here? Well, there is an old tradition in Judaism called Chavruta, which involves bringing two people together to study a text in partnership. And the thought is that by studying together, that more will be uncovered, that through discussion and dialogue and debate, that's where the real learning happens. So hopefully this conversation tonight is part of that Jewish tradition of Chavruta. The museum is actually about to open an exhibition by that same name, which pairs an artist with someone from another discipline of their choosing to make art together. So stay tuned for that, October 23rd. So our two speakers tonight come from very different fields and different worlds, yet I think by the end of the night we'll find that they have a lot more in common, both in their goals and also their approaches in their fields. Both of them focus on experimentation, and their ultimate goal is to engage more people in learning. So the logistics of the evening is each presenter will spend about 15 minutes sharing their work, and then we'll come together to talk about the bigger picture, larger implications for education, and then we'll conclude with a lot of time for all of you to ask questions. So just to give you a little bit more information about the presenters. Ramsey Mussallam, you may know him from his Infinite Thinking Machine videos or his TED Talk, or you might be one of his 4,000 plus Twitter followers. Ramsey Mussallam, EDD, is a high school educator and instructional coach who uses new technologies to create learning environments that promote inquiry, curiosity, and inspire a love of learning. In addition to his role as a science instructor at Sacred Heart Cathedral Prep School, Ramsey directs the school's Center for Inquiry and Innovation and runs invention workshops for elementary and middle school students in the Bay Area. He's an adjunct professor of education at USF and Touro University and inspires teachers globally through his education blog, Cycles of Learning. And Maria Mortati, you might know her from the Walker Art Center's People Imitating Cats internet video phenomenon, or perhaps from right across the street at the Children's Creativity Museum. Maria is a museum exhibit developer who creates interactive, participatory cultural experiences that engage the public in new ways. She's worked on projects ranging from formal museum exhibitions to short-term artistic interventions. Interactive education spaces at the Baltimore Museum of Art, to the San Francisco Mobile Museum, to the People Imitating Cats internet video project at the Walker Art Center. In addition to these projects, she has twice served as panelist on the Innovation Lab at the Center for the Future of Museums. So let's just take a minute to give a round of applause to our two speakers. And now I'd like to invite Ramsey up.
So, instead of people asking me the surgery I performed or the diagnosis I made, what do you think as a chemistry teacher people ask me all the time? Yeah, exactly. So, I stalked a few of my older students' YouTube accounts and put together a little compilation here for you. So, oh, I did plug in this thing. How awkward that is. You mean it just doesn't happen? All right. So hilarious. So, it was kind of an interesting time, and I was 22, 23 years old, and struck with a lot of beginner's luck. I mean, the students really wanted to be in my classroom, and I think for a young teacher with a pretty strict Arab father who wanted him to be a doctor, who didn't get into medical school, there's a lot of narcissism that feeds into that stage, and you can mix up that feeling of being an entertainer versus that feeling of being an educator, and mix both of those up. And then something happened in 2008, 2007 for me, and that was the internet. Web 2.0 happened. Google Docs happened, and my school started asking us to get honest, anonymous feedback from our students. So nothing breeds low-grade alcoholism more than reading honest feedback from 17-year-old kids. I mean, it is ridiculous. Okay, you have to prep yourself for it. And I was like, oh yeah, I love my class. You know, they're lined up. They want to see things explode. They want to be in my class. It's going to be great. So I actually went to the Google spreadsheet. I had to go back to my old Google account to get this, but I screenshotted some for you. I loved watching your blow stuff up, but I still don't have a clue what a stoichiometry is, right? So now, I love the singular on stoichiometry. Hilarious. And these are all from the same class if you look at May's, I think it's 2nd, 2010. So even though I'm not planning on studying science at all, caps lock, in college, your class was the only one I looked forward to this year. So that's kind of nice, right? But they don't want to study at all in college. It seemed, to be perfectly honest, that you were experimenting on us. I hate it when the problem looks different on a test. Stop trying to be all creative and stuff. That one's hilarious. But nothing speaks to the current state of American education more than this next one. This is hilarious. Not sure what this stuff means, but I got an A, so I guess I do. I consider you a friend. Right? So I can really separate that, and it's really nice, yeah? Can really separate that out. It's I mean, beautiful. I mean, this can keep going on and on and on and on, and I'm drinking wine, a glass of wine after glass of wine, as I'm reading this stuff. So, but what is it? So why am I standing up here today? Why am I absolutely in love with my job? Why do I feel like it's the thing I want to do more than anything? You know, what keeps me with Eugene Scheckman, who there's no way that I'm going to ever get this kid to solve this equilibrium problem, and what makes me love that process, even though that feedback existed. What caused this conversation I had with Brendan today at 9:24, where he texted me in the middle of class, hey, it's Brendan, I was just curious about this random question. What does it smell like? What is it made for, or whatever? I mean, totally Napoleon Dynamite-esque, right? And I get to say, you know, let's talk in class, I'll fart, and we can analyze it. And then what prompted Jonathan Chan yesterday to make a little DIY iPhone? I don't really know if this even applies to what I'm talking about, but I had to take this picture because it was hilarious. And here's his view in class as we're doing a soldering experiment. Like, why am I there right now? Why am I loving it? What has kept me going? So, you know, my good friend out of Minnesota, this guy Mark Garrison, we become really close, and he likes to say, in K-12 education, but especially in high school, that we are mirrors. And what he meant by that is the teacher is a mirror, especially in high school. So if you want to create great writers, then you need to try as a teacher to be a writer. That if you want to create makers, then you need to try and make stuff. And we kept going, and he said, if you want to create scientists, then you need to be a scientist. And you need to question. So, and that got me thinking, like, was I modeling that curiosity and questioning? And it's kind of an ironic thing, because my friend Amy here, who's in the audience, can attest that I am an annoying question asker. Like, I constantly am asking questions. We were just camping 3 weeks ago, and I didn't know what a green flash was, and it freaked me out. I'm like, what is a green flash? What is a green flash? And it's all I talked about. Or like as a kid, I remember looking at things like this and just wondering and begging my dad, like, why is water so sticky? I don't get it. And it would drive me crazy to the point where I'd feel anxiety if I didn't have the answers. Or I remember sitting in the Paragon in Davis, a bar there, with somebody doing this and freaking out because I didn't understand why that match lifted like that. And it drove me crazy. And I remember asking tons and tons of questions about it. Or why the heck does this happen? Or why does Indiana Jones freaking think that all things with the same size have the same weight? Like, what kind of PhD in archaeology did this guy get, right? Or is this really possible, right? Trust me, it is. I tried it. Stop! Like, I think I ask tons of questions. But in my classroom, the scientific method was allocated to that. I literally had a quiz for section 1.2 on state the steps of the scientific method, and then went on to units of measurement. Literally, it didn't embody the way I was teaching. It wasn't the thing that embodied the way I was teaching, which, I just never made that connection. I feel like putting a Rilke quote up in a talk is kind of a corny, cheap move, but I went to the City Arts and Lectures last night with Jad Abumrad from Radiolab, and he threw out this quote, so I felt it was okay. So I love what Rilke says in his letters to a young poet, that live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day to the answer. And I don't think I realized it, and it hit me that that is what I had been doing my whole life, that I was actually living science, that I was science, me as a person. That's my existence in the world, that the obscene number of questions that I would ask made me science, and I wasn't modeling that in front of my students, that I could be that mirror, that I was meant to be that mirror. And I feel that now. I feel like my goal is to be the most curious person in the world, not the most entertaining. So it brings me to this idea of job as hobby. I think when in my idealistic version of my default setting, I often feel like, I'm a folk singer, or I'm a jogger, I'm a reader, or, I solve Rubik's Cubes, or do something like that. But I think the hobbies that we all have that last our life are our authentic voice. They are the thing in the dark when no one else is around that we do. They really define who we are. And while I would like to fancy myself a folk singer or a jogger or a reader, I'm a science teacher. And that's okay to say that it's my hobby. It's who I am. I just stepped down from the department chair position at my school, and the next chair, Mark Pagano, when they gave me an Amazon gift card, and he said, "Dude, you're not allowed to use this gift card on anything stupid for your chemistry class. Buy yourself something." But I don't think Mark knew that I just moved to Petaluma with my family, and there's an amazing brewery across the way, and there's a life-size Jenga set there. And I don't think Mark knew that that would be the perfect thing to demonstrate Newton's first law. So 163.07 of that went to the life-size Jenga on May 19th, which Matthew Liu really loves and plays every day when he walks into class. My wife is constantly saying this, "Ram, stop burning stuff in our apartment. It isn't safe." But doesn't she know that there's so much cool stuff on YouTube that I need to test out before I use it in class? Like this one, and I love the plate there that my daughter made. If you listen closely, you can hear my kids in the background. Guys, look at the bag. Watch. Not too safe inside the house. So hilarious. And this idea of if job is hobby, then this idea of the teacher as a manipulator, and I know this sounds kind of weird, but all the research on curiosity can really be boiled down to this, that curiosity is really, really low when all the students know everything, okay? And it's really low when they don't know anything. We know this feeling. Those of you that haven't watched Breaking Bad, then you started watching Breaking Bad, know how this feels. But there's this sweet spot in the middle, this information gap, where you withheld. J.J. Abrams, creator of Lost and other shows, talks about the intentional withholding of information. That when we withhold the perfect amount, we've piqued their curiosity. The tricky thing is that's really hard to do. Give them too much, they're demotivated. Don't give them enough, they're demotivated. I love this quote from the research. Exposure to curiosity in older students is a gamble. One must estimate the likelihood that one's curiosity will be satisfied and how long that will take. But think about that as an ethos. Trying to create questioners, trying to model questioning and creating questioners in the classroom is really hard. It's a balance. You have to manipulate them. I mean, it's a losing proposition. They're required by law to be there, right? So it's very, very, very fun to mirror this and to do this. I think in pop culture, we can think of it this way. Social headlines need to create a curiosity gap. Too vague and I don't care. Too specific and I don't need to click. That this is the balance we're trying to strike with students to get them to be the questioners that we want to be. And this idea of teacher as researcher is something that's really important to me, that's keeping me going, that allows me to sit there with Eugene. David Wallace has a great quote where he says, "Great short stories and great jokes have a lot in common. Both depend on a certain quantity of vital information removed, but evoked by communication in such a way as to cause a kind of explosion of associative connections within the recipient." That's what we want our classrooms to look like, an explosion of associative connections. Now, I've never made it through Infinite Jest, and I don't know if I'd feel the explosion of associative connections that he's talking about, but that's what I want my classroom to look like. Well, how can we figure it out? Like, college professors would drool over the number of subjects that we have every day as teachers, that we need to be doing research. A quick example of something I'm doing this week in my classroom right now. Taking a group of students and doing a little research on their ability to negotiate complexity. So I had a group of kids and gave them this video, a 2-minute and 49-second video that shows them how to balance a chemical reaction. In this case, we have the combustion of propane, C3H8, right there in blue. Okay. So the kids watched it, and then they got shuttled into one of two groups. Group 1 had to do another problem. This problem was C5H12, if you can see right there. And Group 2 had to do C6H14. Now, Group 1 could do C5H12 just by following the algorithm that I gave to them. Exactly. Group 2, and anybody who knows anything about chemistry out here knows that in C6H14, they're going to hit a stumbling block. That there's not enough information to do that one. There's a little bit of information that wasn't in the video. They can't just mindlessly follow it. So as you would probably anticipate, these were the results. Out of a sample size of 100 kids, almost 80% of the Group 1 kids got it right. They just followed the algorithm. And, less than 60% of the Group 2 kids got it right. Interesting, okay? Well, here's some of the qualitative results. Group 1, that was easy. Group 2, that sucked. Group 1, I want to do it again. Group 2, I'm scared to see the right answer. Group 1, that was just like the example, and Group 2, that looked nothing like the example. All right, so then we followed up 10 minutes later with a new problem. C7H16, which can be done using the algorithm perfectly. All they got to do is follow the initial notes. Interesting that this was the results. That Group 1 only increased a few percentage points, but Group 2 went above 90%. Right? And the implications of this are amazing. Group 1, too many oxygens. They just got thrown off by the fact that it was a bigger molecule. Group 2 thought he'd trick us again. It was easy. Group 1, who cares about heptane anyway? Group 2, I wish I could do the first one over. Group 1, this is boring. Group 2, pretty sure this one is right. But what's more fascinating is if you look at a screenshot of their work. So you can tell it's the boy with the chicken scratch up there. But this is one kid in the control group. He's doing C5H12 here, getting it right, and he is following my algorithm perfectly. Literally, every single thing I did, he's doing. Okay? Here, and this is fascinating, is a kid who got the C6H14 right. Now, in that red box, you can tell he's following my algorithm perfectly if you watch the video. But there's something else. I don't know if you see it. That's third grade. Third grade is there. That's long division. In order for him to negotiate the complexity that wasn't in the video, he had to go to third grade, do some long division, and bring it back. That's the explosion of associative connections that Wallace is talking about. That's what we're trying to get. They wouldn't have got there unless he was put in that position. Nate Cornell out of Williams College says, difficulty builds mental muscle while ease often builds only confidence. And I think that I, as a teacher, fell under this trap. Ease building confidence fuels narcissism, fuels the sense of being an entertainer versus an engager, all that stuff. And then finally, I want to close with this idea of teacher as curator. And what I mean by that is we can curate the community experiences within our school that we want to. It's within our power. It's a very powerful thing to be able to close your door and have this world, and you can curate what you want with it. So at Sacred Heart Cathedral, we're trying to find kids that have this natural interest, this natural curiosity about the world, and curate experiences for them to create kind of a grassroots movement. So this is my class website. Another thing we're trying to do with the students is allow them to curate a digital presence. So all my students do all their work in class live on a blog. Here I'm Googling Mairead's blog, and you can see that her AP Chemistry blog comes up 7th on Google right now. I'm Googling Kyla's blog right now, and her AP Chemistry blog is coming up there. So modeling for them what it looks like, what a college admissions director might do to them. Our goal for the year is to learn chemistry, but also to make that their #1 hit. That when they Google, their AP Chemistry blog is going to come up first. And last, what we're trying to do is celebrate student voice at our school. To put their questions forefront. So this is Gino and Nomi, and they're the lead organizers of our first TEDx youth event that we're having at our school on January 17th. Completely run, curated by students, for students of the Bay Area, 13 to 19 years old. So these are experiences that schools that we can create. Now, my school, traditional Catholic school, 6 periods a day, but we can hack that and we can work within that, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. So that's why I love being there. That's why I love working with Eugene. And I think the idea of being a mirror to my students is something that really speaks to me. So thank you very much. Sorry I went over a little bit. Appreciate it.
So, hi, I'm Maria. I want to say thanks to the museum and to Janine for inviting me to come and speak, and I think it's really cool to come and speak with someone who is so different from me, but I definitely, after seeing you talk, there are lots and lots of parallels. I'm not a full-time teacher, nor have I been to TED, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit here. So I do a lot of, as you heard in the beginning, experimental projects with museums, and that started out initially because I worked on very non-experimental projects, very formal projects, and I was kind of preaching to clients at the time when I worked in a studio of how, well, you should try this or you should do that, and I was leading teams to develop a new museum and like, let's go do this or that would be a great idea, and I was kind of like, well, I would like to actually figure that out first, you know, like, is that really true, or, well, you know, let's do that, how could I do that? So I started to do projects on my own, and that really helped sort of shape both my professional practice and my point of view around museums. So how many people here are art education, museum background? Because I'm going to throw a lot of museum stuff at you. Okay. So I think a lot of people know that we've been, in the museum world, have been moving from this, you know, formal, very kind of ossified universe to a much more kind of porous, organic universe. So I like to sort of say it's the old world order and the new world order. This has been going on for a while. And to just set this up, I want to talk about the fact, like, I see both of these things as valid museum experiences. Obviously, the Vatican Museum in Rome is a museum experience, and then at the right, you have at the Walker Art Center, you have artist Chris Kallmeyer on the right there, who did a project there summer before last called American Lawn and Ways to Mow It, where he invited the lawn mower loving crowd in Minneapolis to come bring their mowers, and he orchestrated a big performance where everybody mowed the lawn at the Walker. So those are both museum experiences, those are both art experiences, and what I'm interested in is how those types of new art forms and experiences can play within, around in the space of the museum, and how they can both engage the public in different ways, bring different communities in, but also push on the capacity and skills of the museum and what they can do for museums. So I'm going to show you a couple of projects of my own here along that vein. Here. So this is a project I did with my husband who's here, called The Great Calculation. It was held in LA and San Francisco. Mark collects and maintains mid-century calculating machines, something pretty arcane and not a lot of people know about. And so I was trying to think about, well, how could we engage people with this kind of very rarefied experience? And so created this thing called the Great Calculation, which was a performance, it was taught, and it was workshops in drawing machines and dissecting machines. And it kind of played to all sorts of audiences. It was, I think it was pretty successful and a lot of fun. This is the project that Janine mentioned. So you get a little bit of a preview or show of that. It's like amazing, the whole cat thing. I'm a dog person. But basically I wanted to invert the cat watching experience. And
There you go. There you go. Now stick your head up here, make your meow.
Let's give a big thanks to all of you that participated in that video today.
that was done the day of, so. So this was an artist residency at the Walker with Machine project in LA that I worked on, and I was looking at wayfinding at the museum and how difficult it is to get around that museum. I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's incredibly confusing. And so we looked at how would an artist interpret the wayfinding at the museum. And sort of that was the solution. That seemed a logical thing. So as a result of doing this type of work that was a little bit more social, more experimental, and also, this is also part of an art form. I don't know if people have heard like social practice art or socially engaged art, which is this has also become, some of my work kind of veers into that direction, or I work with people that engage in that type of work. And what's been interesting the last 4 or 5 years is that education departments in art museums are really the ones where these projects are coming out of, and they're turning into departments that are about social practice, or there's titles like Curator of Public Engagement that are now happening at contemporary art museums. And so there's some really interesting, rigorous work that happens there. It looks very informal and very funny, but actually it comes out of a lot of rigor to kind of get to that point where you're actually making a critique about the state of the museum, or the formality of it, or you want to do something that's going to invert a public phenomena, such as, cat videos, and also, by the way, get people to participate. So some of you, I don't know if they pass this around, there's a little document here. This was something that we created for museums that are working on these types of projects called the Elastic Manifesto. And it was just sort of to help museums, because it's been very difficult to do these projects at museums because it's so new. And so I wanted to just touch really briefly on this, like why do it at museums at all? And I think it's really important because you're both building institutional agility, you're learning new skills, you're becoming more nimble, which we all want to do. We all want to get new audiences. But you're also able to get those new audiences because you're working with a new, more social art form, or more types of public engagement projects those artists and those projects bring in new audiences. Also, when you work with these types of new forms of practice, then you're also learning different ways of interpretation. And if you're an art museum, it's great because it's in line with how artists actually work. I'll use the phrase sometimes platforms. What I mean by that is just it's an infrastructure that works out what are the common needs. So we need like a computer platform, but it's the same for museum platforms, or for exhibition platforms, or public programming platforms. So I think that'll. And then just briefly, I want to touch on again, what makes it hard is that it is new, and it's pushing on all these systems, and institutions are not terribly agile in environments, or not just because of if it's an old museum and it's an ossified situation, but they're just not wired that way. So there's things you need to do these experimental projects, and which is you want to create support within your institution. You want to have some transparency. If you're doing a new project, you're like, hey, this is the nature of the beast we're going to take on, and it's going to be a rocky ride, or it's going to be fun, or or we don't know. And you want to sort of give people a sense of what are the parameters, who to call, whose neck to choke if something goes wrong. And then ultimately, if you are working with artists and experienced artists, then also to give up a bit of control and let them lead a little bit, which is kind of hard for museums to do. So I'm going to just show you a quick video about 2 projects I'm going to talk about in a minute that are both coming out of art education departments, or public engagement and education departments. One at a more formal environment at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and one at the Walker Art Center in a much more informal context out on their project Open Field, the lawn project you saw there. So.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't know much about art, but I know what I like. You first start and I'll be with you. All things like man and it's fun to the part, but I don't understand at all. I'm gonna break it someday. That's okay, yeah, I know. I'm gonna break it someday. That's okay.
That's a really freshly groomed piece of property there outside the Walker. So a great thing about this residency I did this summer was having the access to all these resources there at the
A
museum.
Child's History of
Local
Fluxus
Community of
by
Artists.
Dick Higgins. Long ago, back when the world was young, that is sometime around the year 1958,
a lot of artists and composers and other people who wanted to do beautiful things began to look at the world around them in a new way for them.
Everything was itself. It wasn't part of something bigger, fancier. And the fancy people didn't like this because it was all cheap and simple and nobody could make much money out of it.
So I'll start with the BMA project. This is a project, the Big Table Gallery, the Yellow Room, where we started out with the charge of they were building a new contemporary art wing, or they were revamping their contemporary art wing, and the deputy director of education, Ann Manning, was able to negotiate a gallery space right off of the main galleries, and wanted to create a situation where people could kind of ramp up into contemporary art, because it's challenging, it's difficult. People don't understand it. They find it troubling. They don't want to feel dumb, and I don't blame them. So we started out with working with a piece of art from one artist, and we were going to do a space that was all around one artwork, and then it would change out, and we'd have interactive elements, and maybe there'd be a video and all these kinds of things. And so I built some prototypes, we tested them, iterated them, but the artist didn't want anything in the gallery with his work of art once he found out that there might even be a video there. He never even heard about this stuff. So we went back to square one and sort of started to think about, well, what happens, let's look at the whole collection instead of one artist. And so we started to think about, there's a lot of parallels in everyday life with contemporary art. There's what are the things that people see a lot of, that they'll see in their daily life, that they'll encounter in the museum, maybe in a different context. And so text as image, or as it turned out to, it ended up being was words or pictures, pictures or words. And this project we created a platform of the gallery and a system of working with local designers and artisans to change out the space based on a concept that you could find across the contemporary art collection. And so the graphic design was done by Post Typography, a fantastic design firm in Baltimore. And we were inverting the gallery experience by having them create the interpretive materials on the walls with the call-outs talking about the role of the materials. And then there's the big table here where people were doing hands-on activities related to text as image. They also had lectures and programs around graphic design, and they change it out every year now. So the Walker Project, was about this residency that a number of us were doing, which is around how to engage with Fluxus, the art movement. Does anyone know what is Fluxus? Does anyone have a clue? Has anyone heard of Fluxus? It's okay if you say no. Okay, so we have 1.5 hands. All right, no problem. So Open Field, the platform, the project at the Walker Art Center, is a summer project which is usually residencies, and then where the public can also propose projects to do out on the field or the lawn of the museum. And Sarah Schultz, the Director of Education and Curator for Public Practice, I think I got that right. So she wanted us to think about Fluxus, but also to think about what is, how do we convey Fluxus to people, and what is this notion of Fluxus as score? So Fluxus is an art movement from around late 50s, early 60s, sort of a follow-on, you could sort of say, to Duchamp, where people were artists, figured out that they could make, in that little clip the kids were talking, how they could make an observation of this coffee cup here, or the sun on the floor, or the water dripping, is a really beautiful thing. And so they'd write these things called scores, and they'd send them to each other, and they had this little club that was around the world, and then they'd sometimes perform them. So I started to think about, well, how could I convey scores to people in what different ways? And so we you know, we had access to their collections, which was fantastic, you know, as a designer and an artist, being able to see the actual artifacts with a movement that's so incredibly ephemeral gave me some really great inroads into thinking about, like, what the heck is Fluxus. So I sort of did some math, you know, like, okay, Fluxus is about experience, and we have a field, and then the big thing in Fluxus is these written scores, so I'm going to make an interpretive walking trail of scores, you know, but maybe contemporary scores, these sort of instructions that you saw in the field. And then also I wanted to have 2 layers of getting people into this movement, and so I worked with, so you're going to show you another piece. I should just go back and say with the scores that I put on the fields, you'll see I had hashtags in them, which I used as a way to, like, humorously sort of, as an organizing principle, to let people know, oh, this is, you know, this is art, this is history. I worked with local artists to brought their work into it. Then I worked with a local artist to do an event called to build on the Walker's event called Drawing Club. We did Fluxus Drawing Club, where we wrote scores, we made gave them activities, and so we created our own score boxes, or flux kits as they were called historically. So we created them so that the public could try it out, and so they could walk the trail, but they could also go and draw a score. So it was like, put your head down on the paper, have a friend draw the space around it, now fill it in, you know, or crumple a piece of paper up and draw all the lines that are on it, pass it to a friend. So it just got people into this notion that Fluxus is about experience and creating up scenarios that's not about art objects. So we had to actually involve people in experiences to even bring them there. So these are some our happy participants. And to get actually to this idea, a little bit of touching on what Ramsey was talking about, there's a great quote from Anthony Hooverman, which helped us navigate this crazy amorphous art movement this summer, which is called about living the life of the idea. And I think this is an interesting thing for arts educators, and I think this is actually also what you're doing, Ramsey, which is, you know, we had to walk down the metaphorical Fluxus trail and go down the rabbit hole to even be able to understand what it was, so that we could create experiences in which to immerse people in. So I think that is, I consider this sort of like an invitation to all of us, these very complex, difficult movements and things, to kind of go out and immerse yourself in them and actually live that life of the concept or of the idea. And I think that's a great way of doing it. You know, to do that yourself, to do that as your department or as your practice, so that you can more genuinely and less didactically engage people in these kind of pretty complex, nuanced ideas. So thank you very much.
Interesting to me in hearing both of you talk is about this idea of experience, but also both of you seem like you've gone through this path where there's been experimentation, whether if it's something small that becomes a prototype that becomes something larger, or you had a particular teaching practice that then evolved. And so I'm really curious to start out with just talking about the moments in your teaching that have most surprised you, or the moments in your practice where you've seen sort of education happen in the unexpected places, and thinking about how we can harness that for those of us who are teaching in the crowd.
All right, is this on? Okay, so I'll take a stab at that one. So when have I seen sort of the lights go on? I think that's something that I started to practice, like literally, like, let me try an idea out to engage people with, and let's see how this goes. Okay, let me try it this way. I mean, it was really very iterative for me. I don't know that there was one moment, I guess. Well, I guess there was one exhibit that really kind of turned that light on. It was a little exhibit I did at the Maker Faire in 2007, I think. Because I decided Maker Faire is a great place if I have an idea and I need access to a lot of people to try out an exhibition and I don't have a museum. It was like, hey, guess what? There's a Maker Faire. There's like 80,000 people there for 2 days. They're going to try out my idea. And I think that was like taking those kinds of chances where I put it out there to the public and I articulated an idea, and then I got to see, yes, here's how it's working, here's how it's not working. But I think sort of taking the chance to put yourself out there actually was the biggest insight I had, rather than sort of sitting back in my studio and, you know, dreaming things up and writing proposals and plans or something like that.
Yeah, totally. It's being a teacher, if there's any teachers here, it's kind of for me, it was a weird thing. I think it's a weird thing for all people because it's such an ingrained paradigm in our American culture. Like, I remember seeing, you know, we all see teachers at the movie theater and it's super awkward. Like, oh, you know, even like my daughter's teacher, kindergarten, I'm like, whoa, there's Miss Sharp, you know? And it's a weird thing. So then when you become a teacher, I think there's this natural imposter complex or imposter syndrome that happens where you're like, I can't believe they're calling me Mr. There's no way I know what the hell I'm doing, you know? And then suddenly you sort of forget about that imposter complex. But for me, it was the interesting moment. I remember one moment specifically in the classroom when I realized that trying to pretend that I'm not an imposter actually made me more of an imposter. You know, trying to pretend that I didn't have AP Chemistry for Dummies in my bag. And I remember specifically, we were doing this lab activity. This is after you. We're doing this lab activity where these kids were putting just a candle under a jar and it would go out, right? And if I asked all of you, why does the candle go out? I'm sure a lot of you would say because it runs out of oxygen, right? And we all have this fear of choking and all this kind of stuff. But, and the lab was really stupid because I had them put it under a big jar and a small jar, and I said, which one do you think will go out first? And it's like, duh, you know, of course the one that's under the small jar. And I told them, literally, for years, oh, there's less oxygen, it runs out of oxygen. And then one time, I remember this kid in the back of the room raised his hand and literally looked at me and said, I don't believe you. And suddenly this 5'3", like pimple-faced 16-year-old became like 6'12", is like staring at me, you know? And I remember them like looking at him and feeling so afraid that they see me as an imposter and now Rate My Teacher is gonna blow up with what a loser I am and all this stuff. And going back and forth, and I remember saying, it was weird, and I think it was right around when I was in graduate school, I remember saying back to him, prove it. And saying that was a response that I think came from that rabbit hole. Like, I wouldn't have said prove it before. I would have said, let's talk after class. But saying prove it, he became 5'3" again, and he got really excited, and the whole classroom was like, looked back at him, and suddenly he's like, well, let me show you. If you put both candles under the jar and you make one higher than the other, the top one goes out first. So that means that there's still oxygen in there. And it turned into this whole investigation, and we all realized that day that it was its own carbon dioxide putting it out, that there's a ton of oxygen still in there. And I didn't know that. I'd been teaching it that way forever. So just kind of that realization that admitting that you don't know, you think is revealing you as an imposter, but in reality, it's what binds you to the community. And it's counterintuitive, I feel like, with students in high school, because they're so intimidating. I mean, they're so intimidating. They're so intimidating.
How many of you work in a classroom environment? Just a quick read. Okay, and then what about museum environment? More design, what am I missing? Okay, graduate
People
student.
who got into medical school. Whatever.
Ramsey, raise your hand.
MCAT.
So I'm really interested in this idea because I think it pertains both to museums and to schools, this idea that's written in Maria's manifesto, which I love, by the way, about reimagining the system, about that we're agents of change, and there's this institution that we're kind of pushing against. And you alluded to it being a traditional Catholic school and doing this work within, and that changing culture in museums. And just in terms of takeaways for this crowd, I'm wondering if each of you can speak to what are small things you can do within an institution to start to work in more experimental modes?
Is that okay if I go? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and take that one. I think that it really, and I tend to talk a lot, so just stop me. It's really fascinating in education to me that I have a good friend. Has anyone ever played with a makey-makey? You know what the makey-makey? Yeah. So Jay Silver, who invented that, is a friend of mine, and we were sitting down talking one time, and he said, you know, when you meet somebody, you don't go up to them and you don't tell them everything about yourself. You don't reveal your social security number, and you don't say, like, my favorite color is this, and I'm passionate about this, and my hobby's this. You kind of sort of awkwardly talk, and then there's this weird silence, and you're trying not to check your phone, and then you strike off a conversation, and then you might email, and then you get a drink, and then there's this relationship, and suddenly they know everything about you, right? But we don't do that with content in the classroom with kids. Like, we tell them everything about it, and then we say, now we're going to scaffold you so you know it, you have mastered it. It's like the only environment where we do that, where that comes first. So I think, for me, a simple thing, just the realization that lecture is an amazing, amazing tool, but it should be their last experience with the content, that it should be the spackling of the experience, not the tone of the experience. And I think that's something that you know, is really easy and it makes sense, but I think we just naturally don't do it, at least science teachers in the classroom. We naturally feel like we have to tell them information first.
And you're talking specifically about flipping your classroom.
No, so
Nope.
the flipping the classroom movement is really, if those of you who aren't familiar with flipping classroom, it's the idea of, you know, the idea that we use lecture too much in the classroom, so we're going to give students a video lecture to watch to free up room in the classroom. And I think that kind of like what you used to do for homework, you do in class. And on the surface, that seems like a silver bullet. Like, it seems like a good idea. I did my whole doctoral research on it. It seemed like a great idea. But in reality, when you dig deeper, lecture is still lecture. That it doesn't matter where it happens. It's about when it happens. Let's say you watched Breaking Bad, and you watched the ending of Breaking Bad. That's a bad example. I can't even think about it. Flipping the classroom is great, but it should, giving students a video lecture to watch, lecturing to them in the classroom, any form of direct instruction should be a delayed process. That we have these conversations so much about giving kids technology to free up the classroom, but we don't realize that they may not want to watch the video. How can we get them to want to watch it? How can we get them to ask questions about it? And how can we get them to predict what it's going to be about and then curate that experience for them? So I think flipping the classroom is an oversimplified approach, something that I think is more of a technique, not instructional pedagogy, if you will.
So for museums, I think that, you know, a lot of times I used to say just find like a closet somewhere where you could do a project in, and just think of it as like incubating, because really the thing is to practice and to try things, and because that sort of inherent risk-taking and putting yourself out there is not sort of the first foot that museums tend to put forward. So I think really there is a lot to be said about the just do it thing within reason, you know, but I think finding a small space, getting a little bit of buy-in from a couple people, and then trying something out, you know, is priceless. That's how all of these projects actually get started, in these very sort of humble ways, and then they grow because actually you're in a museum and there's more than just you there who can sort of have this knock-on effect. So I think it's get started.
And then I have one last question, then I'd like to make sure that we have plenty of time for everybody in the audience to ask questions. But thinking about transferability of what each of you do, so thinking about, Ramsey, what lessons of the science classroom do you feel like can be applied to kind of more generally in another kind of subject area? Or Maria, things that you can draw on from your own practice in museums that might be relevant to a classroom teacher, just sort of takeaways?
Well, I think I almost feel like the education realm is so much more interactive, you know, than the exhibition realm. The exhibition realm, though, is really good at context, creating context for people, and creating sort of understanding that there's the sociality of experiences and sort of this free choice learning. So we're sort of lucky in a way because you're coming here because you want to come here or because your parents made you come here. On the other hand, you're not going to come back, you know. So I think that there's a lot of techniques that museums should do in terms of prioritizing, presenting, bringing different players in and different layers of experience into one one idea or one subject. So you've got physical things, you've got architecture, you've got public programs, you have visiting artists, you have all these different kinds of things. So I think to think in them a little bit more holistically and not to be afraid to draw other experts in, but to also, curate it, I think, and be mindful and intentional about it. That's very much how museums operate, I think, is they have the time and the capacity, but to be very have this very hyper intentionality about it, and I think that can be actually quite useful in that way.
I think mine is maybe less about just science teaching, but more just instructional coaching in general. I remember feeling a lot that I was just a day ahead of the students, right? That it was day to day, and I'm just going. And when I started to think about my job as my hobby, teaching and lesson planning felt like an art. Like I used to feel envious of my friends that would go to work and have a project that they would come the next day. That when my bell rang, I had to create for myself the next day. And then I realized that was the gift, that is what makes it like art. And instead of thinking it as day by day, think of something I'm going to teach them. And this sounds really corny, but I think it's a really good analogy. That if you think of the hero's journey, you think of a call to adventure, you think of a helper, and you think of transformation. Well, that's just the learning cycle. That if I'm going to teach something as nerdy as intermolecular forces, I can send them on a hero's journey with that. I can create a call to adventure. I can find a place where I'm going to be a mentor and I'm going to do direct instruction. And I can cause them to apply that to some new situation that's going to transform the way they think about it. And taking those kinds of things and thinking of your lesson planning as an organism, that there's all these parts. One of those parts might be lecture or flipping the classroom. But it's this organism that fits into this thing that is at the core of who we are. It's at the core of the media that we watch, and I think that that's a fun way to think about it. The lesson planning is kind of an art form. I think that's what makes it feel like a hobby to me. So.
Great. And so thinking about teaching how we can create a hero's journey to inspire a creative classroom experience. I love that idea. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in our experiment at the Contemporary Jewish Museum. When I called these two, they said, so what is this, and what do we have to do with each other, and how does this fit in at the Contemporary Jewish Museum? So this is our first in a series, and we hope you'll join us on Thursday, January 15th, save the date, because we have psychologist Carol Dweck, who wrote the book Mindset, coming to be in conversation with photographer Michael Light, who does a lot of aerial photography and has rephotographed some images taken from space. So again, another kind of odd and fascinating pairing. But I want to thank both of you for your time and for sharing all of your projects and your wisdom with us. And last, you might have heard as the door opens that there's something going on out there, and this is our quarterly night at the Jewseum. There are cocktails and performances and art making and all kinds of stuff happening, so I really encourage you to go outside and have some food, have some drink, and enjoy the rest of the museum. And thanks so much. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.